Is moral realism true? That's the topic that we'll be discussing today. I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. I'm joined by two guests, Dr. Eric Sampson in the middle and Dr. Jonas Olson on the right. Eric is a professor of philosophy who has published quite a bit on in metaethics, specifically on moral realism. And Dr. Olson is also a professor of philosophy who specializes in metaethics and has published in defense of anti-realism, specifically error theory, right? Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so we're going to have a discussion between these two, and we'll start out with you, Eric. Can you just first explain what moral realism is and maybe your reasons for thinking that it's true?
Sure, yeah. So let me begin just by saying what I think it is. And I think on this, Jonas and I are in agreement. So in slogan version, or in slogan form, realism is the view that there are moral truths. We can come to know some of them, and those truths are discovered rather than invented. That's the slogan version. I mean, there's a more precise characterization, so I'll give that one very quickly, hopefully. The first one, you characterize it in four key claims. The first is cognitivism. That's the view that at least sometimes moral judgments express beliefs aimed to represent moral reality. And so because they're beliefs, these beliefs are capable of being true or false. So that rules out non-cognitivism, according to which our moral judgments, like that some action is right or wrong or good or bad, are just expressions of our preferences or our attitudes of approval or disapproval or our intentions or something like that. So that's cognitivism. Our judgments express beliefs. The next component claim is stance independence. That's the idea that the moral truths, if there are any, aren't grounded in the attitudes of any agent, actual or hypothetical. So a textbook case of a stance-dependent property is the property of being Saturday. So we're recording this on a Saturday. What makes it the case that this is a Saturday? Is Saturdayness written into the universe? Of course, the answer is no. It's Saturday because we agreed on it. So whether it's Saturday or not depends on our stance or our take or our attitudes. And a textbook case of a stance-independent claim, the kind of claim that realists ascribe to morality, is something like this. The sun is larger than the earth. That's true independent of anyone's attitudes. Even if we all believe that the earth was larger than the sun, we'd be wrong because reality sort of, stands independent of our attitudes and can show us that we're wrong. So morality, the idea is that morality is like that, according to the realists. The third claim is non-nihilism. It's just the view that some of these moral judgments that we make are true. So that rules out nihilism, the view that none of our moral judgments are true. And last is non-skepticism. So most realists, I guess it's not like, strictly speaking, one of the claims that are constituent of it, but most realists want to claim that some people know at least some moral truths that are out there. So this rules out moral skepticism, according to which there maybe are truths, but we couldn't come to know the moral truths if there were any such things. So again, the slogan form is there are moral truths, we can come to know them, and those truths are discovered rather than invented. So let me say something about why do people care about this? Why do they argue about it? I mean, at least one reason that they care is because if moral realism is true, that would mean that you have moral obligations to help others and not to do bad things to them. So there are demands that are placed on your life that are sort of independent of what you care about or what your goals are. So you can't just get out of them by changing what you care about or what your goals are. There might be some things that you ought to do, even if you don't want to do them. So that's one reason. And then I'm sure, Jordan, many of your viewers here are theists. So at least on the realist take, this means that, if there is a God and if he loves his creatures, he loves them because they are genuinely lovable or worthy of being loved. It's not as though they are valuable because God values them. It's quite the opposite, that God recognizes our value and loves us on that basis rather than he confers our value by valuing us and making it the case that we're valuable. Okay, so very quickly, let me just try to say why I believe that realism is true. So I've done a video for this channel where I try to go through some positive arguments for realism. So you can watch that if you want to see me outline those arguments. But for the most part, I believe in realism, not because of any fancy philosophical argument like the ones that I characterized in that video, but mostly I believe in realism about morality for the same reason I believe in realism about time or causation or other minds or truth or emotion or mathematics or phenomenal consciousness. In other words, I believe in all of those things that I just described, and I believe they're mind independent. And why do I believe that? Well, the first step is just, it seems clear to me that all of those things that I mentioned are features of reality. It seems clear to me that this interview is happening after World War II. If that's true, then there is such a thing as time. It seems obvious to me that when I flip on the switch, I cause the light to go on. It seems to me that causation is just obviously a part of the world. It seems true to me that fish have gills. If that's true, then there is such a thing as truth. So some fish have gills. That would be a true claim. It seems clear that my hand moves across space. If that's true, then motion is a part of the world. I mean, I could do this for lots of different things. And it seems true. It seems obviously true to me that it's morally wrong to burn people alive for the reading light it provides. It seems as clear to me as any of those other claims that I just mentioned. Now, it could be that all those claims are true, but they're not mind independently true or stance independently true. So why would I think that? Because even if all those claims are true, it doesn't follow that they're stance independently true. Well, I mean, for each of those things, including morality, when I just think about like, well, you know, this interview is happening after World War II. Is there some stance? Is there some agent whose attitudes makes it the case that this is happening after World War II? Seems to me the answer is no. It's happening after World War II, even if everybody believes that this interview is happening before World War II. Or at the simultaneous with World War II, or something like that. And similarly with the claims about motion or mathematics and morality. So when I think about, you know, the fact that it's wrong to burn people alive for the reading light it provides, I think, is there any agent whose attitudes makes it the case? Is it wrong to burn people alive because I don't like it when people do that? No, that wouldn't be enough to make it wrong. Is it wrong because, you know, like the culture, you know, generally disapproves of that kind of thing? No, that wouldn't be enough to make it wrong, and so on for basically any agent that you can think of, hypothetical or actual. So that's the reason why I think that morality is a part of reality, and it's stance independent reality. So it doesn't depend on any particular agent's stance. So none of that was terribly sophisticated. And so I'm not especially embarrassed by that. So I didn't appeal to some grand metaphysical principles and like show you like via like a 7-step deduction that there is such a thing as morality and that it stands independent and cognitivism is true. I didn't do any of that stuff. And I'm not embarrassed by that. I think that's just true of most of the things that are part of reality. We don't have ready to hand, and we couldn't even have these grand philosophical arguments that, you know, establish the truth by means of certainty. And part of that is because some of these claims are as certain as you could possibly get. If we wanted to give a grand philosophical argument for the truth, for the existence of motion or causation or something like that, we would have to appeal to claims that are less obviously true than the claim that, you know, when I flip the light switch on, it turns it on. It causes it to come on. That seems as clear as anything. There are no premises I could appeal to that are more self-evident than that to try to establish the truth that causation is real, or that time exists, or that there are other minds, or that it's morally wrong to burn people alive for the reading light it provides. So I don't have a grand philosophical argument. That's because many of these claims that I'm appealing to are as clear as any philosophical claim could be. So that's why I think that morality exists. That's a part of reality, stance-independent reality. And that's also, for what it's worth, why I don't accept a lot of arguments against realism. It's because they often appeal to claims that are far less plausible than any of the sorts of claims that I just appealed to right there. They appeal to really controversial, really abstract, really philosophical claims, several of them, multiple of them, not especially intuitively plausible, and they try to derive the conclusion that there's no such thing as morality. So in general, that's why I don't accept arguments against them. Okay, so maybe I'll stop there. That's the rough characterization.
Okay, you said quite a bit there.
Yeah.
So here's what I'd like to do. I want you two to have a back and forth discussion. I'll only step in if I need to, but I have a good feeling that this will be a nice discussion and we'll have a good exchange. What I may do is actually remove myself from the screen. I can still hear you, but it'll just be you two having a discussion. And like I said, I may pop in if I've got a question or feel the need to step in. Sound good?
Yep.
It's all right.
All right. So Jonas, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can start wherever you like with whatever Eric just said. Pick it up wherever you want to.
Right. Perhaps I could start with a little autobiographical spiel. So when I started studying philosophy, I was fascinated with meta-ethics. But when I began writing my PhD thesis, I wasn't working specifically on the traditional issues in meta-ethics. I was doing work on value theory and so on. And I guess my meta-ethical, I guess I was leaning towards the kind of realism that you support, roughly for the reasons that you mentioned. It just seemed to me plausible that it's morally wrong to, what did you say, turn people alive?
Yeah, burn people alive or something like that. Yeah,
burn people alive for in order to use them as candlelights. But I always had this kind of feeling of unease. I wasn't very happy with the metaphysical commitments that the view came with. And at the same time, I was even more unhappy with the naturalist alternatives and the non-cognitivist alternatives. So I agree with you that those views are not promising. And then I guess what happened when I started working on the traditional meta-ethical issues was that I thought more carefully on, okay, so what would have to be the case for there to be moral requirements? I agree with the conditional claim that if there are moral requirements, they are stance independent, as you said. But then think about, what would that mean? What does that mean? Well, I mean, we know what it is for there to be requirements, like legal requirements. We know what it is for there to be requirements in various games like chess and football and what have you. We know roughly why there are such things, because we know that these are conventional requirements. They are the results of agreements between people. They are the results of people's expectations and desires and preferences and so on. So that's all understandable. It makes good sense. But then think about these putative stance-independent requirements. Since they are stance-independent, we can't explain their existence, of course, in terms of the expectations and desires or preferences and so on of people. They would have to be very different, and I still cannot understand how there can be any such things. And that's my reason for not believing in realism. It just seems to me not credible that there are such truths or such facts. Although I agree with you that it is prima facie highly plausible that torturing people for fun is morally wrong. When we think carefully about, okay, what would have to be the case for this to be true, then I think I'm strongly tempted to accept the conclusion that it isn't wrong.
Good. So can I ask you a quick question? So I mean, in your written work and here just now, you've said that you find it sort of mysterious or sort of unintelligible that there could be these stance-independent truths about what you ought to do. So do you mean that you can't see how it could be true, or do you mean that you can see what would need to be true, and you can see that couldn't possibly be the case? Can you see it? I don't know if that distinction is clear, but yeah. On one, I can't even see how it could be true. On the other, I can see exactly what would need to be true, and I can see that couldn't be the case.
Yeah. So I don't think, I mean, this is a difficult question, but I'm inclined to respond that what I think I can see is that that there can be no such truth, not because it's incoherent. I mean, it's not like you're saying that that there are round squares or anything like that. I think the idea of a stance-independent requirement is coherent, but I mean, there are many things that are coherent that are just too strange to be credible, I think.
Good, yeah. So I agree that it's weird, but I wonder how you would react to this thought. Morality is weird, especially when you get to the foundations. I mean, when you look at sort of like normative ethics and applied ethics, it doesn't seem so strange. But when you sort of, as you just described, you get into like, what would the world need to be like in order for there to be such requirements, then it does get a little strange for the reasons that you say. But I wonder what you would say to this. Yeah, it's true, but that's true of basically every domain of philosophy. So if you think about consciousness, the foundations of consciousness, like how could it be the case that like these brains give rise to these conscious states? I don't see how there could be laws that like mediate the connections between like brain states and like the smells, the sensation of a smell or an audible sensation or something like that. I don't see that that there can't be such laws or that there can't be such a connection, but I can't see what the connection is. Similarly, laws of nature, I take it that there are laws of nature, but some people think that laws of nature like govern the universe. That is, that they sort of make it necessary that the heavenly bodies move in the way that they do. And they're not just summarizing what the heavenly bodies do, they're governing in some sense. But how could it be the case that this non-physical thing, this law of nature, governs the. I don't see how that could happen. With truth, I don't really know what a proposition is or how it could represent reality as being a certain way. Or similarly, I don't know like how our brain states could represent the world as being a certain way. And yet, I mean, I think there's such a thing as truth. So I think there are laws of nature. I think there's truth. I think there's consciousness. In all of these cases, I mean, we could do the same thing for mathematics, the foundations of mathematics. Things get super weird there. When you get to the metaphysics of time, things get super weird there. So I wonder what you'd say to this thought. Yeah, it's weird in morality, but that's no different than all these other domains, which we should totally think are legitimate. Time, causation, consciousness, truth, laws of nature, all those are weird at the foundations, and it's weird at the foundations of morality too. We shouldn't worry about this.
Yeah, I think that's the way to go for a realist like you. But so take consciousness, for example. About that case, I would say that nihilism about the mental, or about nihilism about consciousness, that doesn't strike me as plausible at all, for the banal reason that I think I have very immediate access to some mental properties. I mean, right now I have the experience of how coffee tastes, for example, when I take a sip of the coffee, and it would take a very strong, I think, philosophical argument to persuade me that I don't have the experience of tasting coffee right now. Or take the problem of other minds. I mean, you might say, I think you said something to the effect that it seems highly plausible to you that other people have minds, and that other people are consciousness in roughly the way that you are. I agree that kind of Moorean premise, that kind of Moorean proposition, has force, and I think unlike the so-called moral Moorean propositions, I think this one has force even after we have considered it carefully. Because when I think about, okay, so what would have to be the case for it not to be true that other people are conscious, have experiences, and so on? Well, something very surprising would have to be the case. They would have to be zombies or some kind of machines or whatever, and I mean, that would give rise to all sorts of strange questions. Seems to me easier to understand that, or easier to imagine that these other people are actually conscious in roughly the way that I'm conscious. That they have a mental life in roughly the way I do. So that's, I think, a disanalogy, a crucial disanalogy between the moral case and the mental case. And then more generally, I'd say that I agree with you, of course, that there are lots of things in the world that certainly lots of things that I don't understand, and certainly lots of things that we as the species don't understand. We can't. There are lots of things we can't explain, like the relation of the mental to the physical and so on. But one thing that's especially troubling about the moral and the normative, I think, is that it seems to me that it'll be interesting to hear if you agree about this, but it seems to me that the moral doesn't explain anything non-moral. Whereas for, I think, most other things you mentioned, these phenomena do explain other phenomena as well.
Yeah. So, I guess the move there. So yeah, this is the moral facts don't explain. You mean like causally explain or something like that? Or what kind of explanation are we talking? Because of course, as you mentioned, like it explains the normative stuff. But yeah, and so I guess what the realist would want to say is, well, it explains the kinds of things that it was enlisted to explain in the first place. It was never enlisted to explain, causal explanation. It was never enlisted to do causal explanations. The fact that it doesn't do that isn't especially problematic. But I don't know, maybe I guess that was my first reaction, which is like, well, it doesn't causally explain anything, but that's never what it was intended to do.
Well, it doesn't explain our beliefs about morality or about normative matters either, it seems to me.
Good. Yeah. Do you think that, I mean, the standard thing to do, which I'm sure you know, is to appeal to things like mathematics and logic and possibilities. It doesn't look like we can know what the possibilities are, but it doesn't look like the possibilities themselves are causing us to believe certain things. Same with the mathematical truths or the logical truths. Doesn't look like, I wonder this too. Do you think the error theory itself explains why we believe the error theory? Like, are we in causal contact with it? Does the error theory causally explain anything or explain in any way? I guess, I mean, this is the sort of standard, companions in guilt or innocence move, but it seems like a lot of these are the kinds of things that don't do the kind of explanatory work that you accuse realism of not doing. I mean, correctly, it doesn't do the kind of explaining that you say, but I guess the thing what the realists want to do is deny that it ought to be doing this.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough, and I agree with that point. My point about explanation was merely meant to explain why I think that the so-called Moorean propositions, I'm not sure whether you use that expression at all, but
I'm happy to use it. That's fine. Yeah.
These propositions that seem to you obviously true, they have force in some cases, but not in others. I mean, I don't think they are, on reflection, forceful in the. I mean, they are prima facie forceful in the moral case, right. Not all things considered. But I think they are forceful in for example, the case of consciousness, because consciousness explains many things, it seems to me.
Right. Yeah, I wonder in the consciousness case if it's sort of a happy accident that we have direct access to these things, whereas like if we were taking a perspective outside of it, well, yeah, if we were taking a perspective outside of it, we'd say, no, there's no way there could be any sort of like things going on there.
Well, I don't have direct access to your consciousness.
That's
but
right.
It still seems to me that, what would have to be the case for it to be not true that you are conscious? Well, I can't rule it out. I mean, there is a possibility. There is an epistemic possibility that you are not conscious, but it seems to me that would be a very strange scenario. It seems to me much more likely that you are actually conscious in roughly the way I am, and that your experiences resemble mine and so on.
Yeah. Can I ask you about the intuition that sort of underlies the argument from queerness, which is this sort of like, I don't see what could be what the world would have to be like in order for there to be these things. As you mentioned, in your book, Moral Error Theory, History, Critique, Defense, I think it is, just a little plug for the book, which is excellent. I think you argue there that the queerness argument relies on an intuition about irreducibly normative favoring relations being queer. And you sort of, I think you characterize it as metaphysical bedrock. That is, some people have that intuition, other people don't. I think you mentioned David Enoch, who at least claims in his book that he just doesn't have the intuition that irreducible normativity is queer. So I wonder, do you think that it's rational for people who just don't have the queerness intuition to continue to believe in more realism or non-naturalism or something like that, and also rational for those who do have the queerness intuition to continue to hold their views? In other words, could it be the case that actually it's rational for you to hold multiple views in metaethics, depending on whether you're the kind of person who has this bedrock intuition either for or against the queerness of irreducibly normative truths?
I'm a little uneasy about the word rational, I must say.
Yeah. Or sorry, yeah, I know. However you would characterize that in suitably error theoretic terms. I'm sure you have some way of saying like, it's indicated by the truth of the evidence that we have or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I think I'd say that the best evidence speaks in favor of error theory. I'm also prepared to say that this evidence is, it's accessible to any meta-ethicist.
But maybe not the queerness intuition. If Enoch is correct in his report, let's suppose that he is for the moment, he just doesn't have the queerness intuition you do. If intuitions serve as a sort of justification, at least prima facie, for the philosophical views that we have, it might be the case that Enoch is justified in being a realist, you're justified in being an error theorist based on the differing intuitions that you have. But maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, but I guess I'm inclined to say that he's missing something. There's something he fails to see. And of course, he would say the same thing about me, that there's something, or yeah, he would say the corresponding thing about me, that I think I see something that isn't there, or something like that.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah.
But I mean, how to resolve that issue? I think that's a very difficult methodological problem.
Yeah. So actually, let me ask you about this, because that is sort of a deep, sort of intractable disagreement about that sort of serves as one of the premises in the argument for error theory. So I wonder how you would respond to a thought like this. In order for your particular defense, there are many defenses of error theory, but in order for your defense of the error theory to succeed, you'd have to be right about the conceptual commitments of moral discourse. That is, that moral discourse is committed to a really strong version of irreducible normativity, that it's, problematically queer, that the degree to which evolution has influenced the content of our views is pretty heavy, because that's the way that you rebut Moorean arguments. And the soundness of evolutionary debunking arguments is in good shape, and the defenses and the responses to it are not good, and so on. So in other words, it looks like in order for the case for error theory to be successful, it needs lots of pretty high-level philosophical claims to be true, whereas on the Moorean view, you just need one claim to be true. And if you do the plausibility comparison, there's one really highly plausible, intuitively and prima facially plausible view, compared to the many views that, or the many claims that the error theorist needs to be true in order to vindicate the error theory. When you do that plausibility comparison, at least people like me say, realism comes out on top. I don't know. How would you respond to that sort of thought?
Well, I mean, perhaps you exaggerated a bit there, because aren't you as well committed to the stance independence, for example? I think you made that you made that a definitional feature of realism, right? So that's and that's basically what I find strange. I mean, I when I wrote the book, I chose the terminology of irreducible normativity, mainly because I felt that was the expression that is being used, and people seem to know what they were talking about when they used it, and I thought that I knew roughly what it meant as well. So therefore, I went with that expression. But I could have gone with with your terminology instead of stance independence.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So I think that's the right analysis of moral thought and discourse, that moral facts, moral properties are stance independent. So yeah, I'm committed to that, but then so are you, right? So
right, that's right, yeah. So I wonder what you think about this. Suppose you wanted to preserve the view that it's wrong to burn people alive or whatever, take the really bad moral thing. You're not committed yet to the stance independenceness of it all. So that's the view that or that's the claim that you think is super highly plausible. Why not give up on like the stance independence component or the cognitivism component or any of the others to preserve this really plausible claim, and give up one of the other sorts of claims and be like an expressivist or a constructivist, rather than the error theorist who has to endorse the conceptual claim, the view that morality is conceptually committed to irreducible normativity and cognitivism and all that stuff. Like, why do you give up the really plausible claim and hold on to the less plausible claims? Why not, give up on one of the other ones and be an expressivist or constructivist? Yeah,
that's a fair point. I think it's a fair question. I think that it depends on how you view the aim of metaethics. I mean, what's the point of doing metaethics? And I think what makes it interesting is that we want to uncover the nature of our moral thoughts and moral discourse. That's why I think metaethics is fascinating. And then I think it would be strange to have as your as one criterion of adequacy some moral truths, like that it's wrong to, what did you say, torture in some people.
I mean, just any of the bad stuff. I don't know.
I think that would be kind of an odd methodology.
Yeah, well, I guess the idea is like we come to philosophy with views already in hand. Some seem more plausible than others to us. One of them is that, I take it that error theorists.
It's a bit like approaching. Sorry for interrupting, but it's a bit like approaching the free will problem with the idea that, okay, so one condition of adequacy is that we have free will. No matter what that means, but that seems to me an odd approach.
Yeah, I don't think of it like that. So here's how I was thinking of it. We come to metaethics with lots of views that we think are correct. It looks like some of them are in tension, and so we need to figure out, okay, which ones are we going to give up? One of the ones we think that strikes us as really, really plausible is this moral claim. So the idea isn't like under all circumstances we must save morality. It's just that we want to do the least violence to our judgments that strike us as really, really plausible. And the best way to do that is to give up on these claims about, for instance, what moral discourse is committed to. Like maybe we're wrong about what moral discourse is committed to. I mean, you and I both agree that it's committed to a pretty strong sort of irresistible normativity, but maybe we're wrong about that. I mean, I'm much more confident that it's wrong to kill people, than I am that morality is committed to, some really strong version of irresistible normativity. So the idea is like, look, we're trying to make our views coherent, and the best, and you, in general, you want to give up the claim that you're least confident in and hold the you're most confident in, and then you keep the moral claim. It's not because it must be saved at all costs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think I share that methodology, and I think I mean the reason I believe in or actually I should be honest and say that I'm not a fully convinced error theorist. I'm actually fully convinced about very few issues in philosophy. But I often say that my highest credence when it comes to meta-ethical theories, my highest credence is in error theory. I find error theory, on the whole, more plausible than any of the alternatives. I think I share the methodology that you outlined, this kind of reflective equilibrium methodology. And the difference, I guess, is that what seems to me, in the end, more plausible is the error theorist view, because I think that's actually the view that. This is something you might find surprising. I think that's actually, in the end, I think that's the view that is least revisionary. I mean,
yeah, obviously we disagree on that issue, but I think that's right. That if you're an error theorist, you have to
clarify qualify that a bit. I mean, it's a lot less revisionary than, for example, non-cognitivism, as you mentioned, as an alternative. I think all the non-cognitivist theories that I'm familiar with fit poorly with our ordinary way of speaking and thinking about normativity. I haven't seen yet a naturalist theory that's convincing. I mean, I think that the non-naturalist view that you favor does well in sort of accommodating our thoughts and discourse, but then again, there is this tiny detail of reality.
Good, yeah. So I have another question for you. So many of the viewers of this channel are going to be theists. This channel is called The Analytic Christian. So a lot of people think that God's going to have to find some way into the story about the foundations of morality. So suppose for a moment, and I know you probably don't think this is correct, but suppose for a moment that you can rationally believe in theism or have good grounds for it or something like that. Roughly the view that there is an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God, roughly like the Abrahamic traditions. Do you think theists do you think such a being's existence would help in any way, one, avoid the error theory, and two, support more than just non-error theory, but some kind of realism? Or do you think even if there were such a being, like the error theory would still be true? What do you think about
that? Yes, I would think that the error theory would still be true, because I mean, why would it matter if there were such a being? I guess people who believe in such a being, they will want to say that, well, we ought to follow the dictates or the demands of such a being. Okay, but then there is the question: ought we to, or why ought? First, ought we to do that? And secondly, why ought we to do that? One plausible answer is that, well, it's a normative truth that we ought to follow the dictates of such an all-powerful and omniscient and so on being. But that seems to be an independent normative fact, right? That's independent of this super powerful being. And again, that would have to be a strange kind of fact.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people think, well, if there were a God, something like the Abrahamic God, one of his properties would be, he'd be all good. I don't know if that's a cheat, but at least, that's one reason you might think that, well, look, if God exists, then like there's guaranteed to be some kind of morality because he's a perfectly good being. I don't know if that does. So that's supposed to suggest if you do have good grounds for believing in God, now you have really good grounds for believing in some kind of morality. Maybe not a realist morality, but at least some kind, maybe a constructivist, maybe a dying command theory or something like that.
Well, I think that this would take you to the Euthyphro problem. Should we go into that? Should we say something about that?
I mean, you can. Yeah, I think people would be interested, especially hearing, I think they'd be interested in hearing your take. Yeah.
I mean, suppose first of all, like I already said, suppose that there is this independent truth that you ought to follow the demands of this powerful being. Then I mean, why then would God be crucial for morality? Why not say then that okay, so there are these fundamental normative or moral facts, and they are independent of God. Okay. I suppose that there aren't any such fundamental facts to the effect that we ought to obey God's dictates or demands. Well, then the question is, why ought we to do it?
Good. So I think a lot of people who are watching this and thinking about the error theory, the standard view is if you accept the error theory, then you have to basically throw moral thought and discourse out the window. Like you just have to abolish it, get rid of it. But you've written, that you shouldn't do that. And that's really surprising because one, there's a question about what is the should going on here. We shouldn't throw out morality. Instead, we should do something else with it. So can you, briefly just say a bit about what you think we should do in light of this what next problem or the now what problem?
Yeah, that's a difficult or tricky issue. But first of all, I mean, since the kind of view that I favor is not just an error theory about morality, but about normativity in general, at least the kind of irreducible normativity that Parfit and Enoch and other philosophers talk about. Since that's the kind of sort of broad error theory that I favor, I cannot say, of course, that that we ought to abandon normative thought and discourse. Neither can I say that that we ought to keep it, of course, at least not in the irreducibly normative sense. But the first point to keep in mind and to explain is of course that it doesn't follow from the truth of error theory that you ought to stop talking about morality or stop thinking about morality. In fact, that would be incompatible, I think, with the view I favor. So then I think and also it's worth pointing out, I think, that it will be very difficult, well nigh impossible, I think, to stop think in moral terms. Maybe even impossible, well nigh impossible to stop talking about right and wrong and so on. So then, but I think we can raise a question. Okay, so what would be advisable in the sense that what would best promote our interests, and I'm not talking then about my sort of personal myopic interests, but sort of our common interests, our interest as a society. Can it still be useful to talk about morality? And I think it can. So, and I think this goes for a lot of, or maybe not a lot, but this goes for other phenomena as well. It can still. So I'm inclined, for example, to accept the view that there is no free will. I mean, this is another, of course, another big topic and another conclusion that is extremely difficult to accept and sort of implement in your daily life. Right? It's extremely difficult not to believe in free will and many things that are usually thought to come with it, like responsibility and praise and blame and so on. So might it still be advisable in the sense that, in the sense of serving our interest, to attribute free will and responsibility and to people, and to praise and blame people? And I think the likely answer is yes. And I think that it goes for morality broadly as well. So some people have thought that as a consequence of accepting error theory, we should somehow transform our moral thought and discourse and change it in some way or other. So some people have defended fictionalism about moral thought and discourse. So we should think about moral facts much as we think about fictions, much as we think about the Lord of the Rings or what have you. Now, for many reasons, I don't think that is a promising view. In fact, I think that there is no good. In the end, there is no good explanation for why we shouldn't just go on as we have been doing. Of course, we'd be uttering falsehoods all the time and believing falsehoods and so on, but we can live with that.
I like the free will example because it does seem like even if you think that you don't have it, like you really have no choice but to carry on as if you do. But that's often because we don't have to negotiate with one another about free will issues. But with moral issues, especially political issues, which are basically just moral issues, we often do have to talk with one another, and we have to deliberate together, and we have to offer arguments for this policy rather than that policy. And I wonder if we could really sustain that sort of talk with the full knowledge that none of it is true. I wonder if there's a disanalogy there between the free will case and the morality case, because it doesn't look like we could all collectively sort of carry on with the moral talk when we know it's all nothing. If anything, it would you might even think it would be pernicious, because knowing that it's all false, we would just sort of use moral talk to just promote our own interests. And you might think a lot of people already do this. That is, they wrap their own interests in moral talk, and they really are just trying to push each other around using moral talk.
Yeah,
that seems like a threat. I don't know.
I mean, that one can only speculate about this, but I mean, are we now talking about a scenario in which we have all become convinced that the error theory is true, or are we thinking about someone who has been persuaded that the error theory is true and is surrounded by people who aren't so persuaded? I mean,
good. Yeah, these are two different questions, and maybe they have two different answers. I guess I thought when most people think about the now what question, which is the question of what to do with moral talk once you become an error theorist, they were theorizing about it in terms of what do we do once everybody comes to accept the error theory. So I don't know. I mean, maybe do you think actually there's one theory that's correct to the now what question for the individual who is in a sea of other people who believe in morality? And then there's another answer to the question of what we should do with moral talk once everybody comes to accept the error theory. You could take either case.
Yeah, I mean, let's take my own case. I mean, the real me, as it were, in my present situation. I guess I'm like I said, I'm not fully persuaded by the truth of error theory, but I'm inclined to believe that it's the most plausible view. I realize that I'm surrounded by people who are mostly by people who are not error theorists. Most people who have heard about the view don't believe it, and most people I meet have never heard of the theory. And I sometimes use moral vocabulary. I do it because I have strong political views on some issues. There are certain things that I would like to see promoted. There are some things I strongly dislike, deeply dislike, and other things that I like. And I use moral language to promote these things, to persuade people. That's my way of thinking about my own moralizing from the detached perspective, as it were. And I think that's fine. I think that's how most people use moral language. I think actually that a lot of what non-cognitivists, for example, say about the reason why we moralize, that it has a lot to do with our attitudes and what we are for and what we are against and so on, in some cognitive sense. I think that's roughly true as an explanation, as a kind of at least part of a psychological explanation for why we moralize, why we engage in moral thinking and moral discourse. But I don't think it tells us anything interesting about our moral concepts or the meaning of our moral expressions. Does that make sense? So
yeah, absolutely.
So I will still go on moralizing. In fact, it will be, like I said before, it would be extremely difficult to stop moralizing because I have this abstract meta-ethical commitment.
And by your own lights, you wouldn't be making any mistakes because there's no like norms that you're flouting, or at least no irreducibly normative norms.
Yeah. The only mistake I would be making is that I would be uttering falsehoods, of course, and believing falsehoods. But again, that's something I will have to live with.
Yeah.
If it's cool, I'm going to go ahead and jump in because we're at the 45-minute mark. And I mentioned at the beginning that I've got about an hour and a half. So this could potentially be the halfway point. We may end it sooner. But there were a few things that haven't come up maybe as in depth as I would like that I'll bring up now. So a while back, I interviewed Eric on... So Eric, I think, co-authored a paper with Alex Hune that critiqued some of Jonas's arguments. Is that...
I think that was Bart Strumer. Actually.
Oh, was that?
So there was two different ones. So yeah, one was about parsimony. That was with Justin Morton, and that did critique the argument from queerness from Jonas. And then there was one with Alex Hune that was about Bart Strumer's argument that we can't believe the error theory.
Yeah. Okay, so set the Bart Strumer one aside.
Okay.
That paper may not be super relevant right now, but it's related to what I'm going to say. So, Eric started out by laying out a Moorean argument. My understanding is, Jonas, you think that we can overcome that Moorean argument by appeal to evolution, like an evolutionary debunking argument. Is that right?
No, actually, it's not.
No.
Well, it has to be severely qualified. That was actually something that Eric mentioned earlier that I wanted to protest against, and but then I forgot it. So I'm not. Well, it depends, first of all, on what the Moorean argument is. Is it? And that's not always clear in the debate. So there are at least two possibilities. So here's one possibility. The idea might be that someone says roughly what Eric said before, that take any old moral proposition like it's wrong to torture people just for fun. We know that. Okay, that seems extremely obvious to most of us. If the appeal is to the general consensus and to how strongly, how convinced we are about about the truth of this proposition, then I think in that case an evolutionary explanation might be useful, because the evolutionary explanation predicts just that we will believe in that proposition, and that we will feel confident about it. But a Moorean argument doesn't have to appeal to a kind of consensus and degree of confidence. The Moorean argument might be rather, and this might be closer to what Eric has in mind, it might be that the person defending the Moorean argument might say something like, "Well, I have this intellectual seeming, this intellectual appearance that this is true. This is how it is. I can see that it's wrong to torture people just for fun. Never mind consensus and whether most people actually believe this. I can see this with the kind of clarity, distinctness that I can see that 2 + 2 = 4, something like that." Okay. Then I think that evolutionary debunking arguments are impotent. They don't have anything to say to that, because I mean, what evolutionary explanations can do is only to explain why you believe something. In this case, why you believe. I mean, well, this is highly debatable, of course, as well. But let's just pretend that they can explain this thing. I doubt that they can perhaps explain something as particular. But anyway, let's pretend that there is an evolutionary explanation for why you believe this thing. I think such an explanation has very little to say about the epistemological question whether you are justified in believing this thing. Because again, the only thing it can do is that it can explain why you believe it. But then it seems to me it cannot answer the question, are you justified in believing this? These seems to me to be two different questions. And I think, unfortunately, these questions are often run together by some proponents of debunking accounts. So I think actually that debunking accounts can do fairly little in the debate between nihilists and realists. It can be of help to nihilists if the realist appeals to consensus in the way I said earlier, but not if the realist appeals to this kind of self-evidence. Then I think the nihilist would just have to insist that you're committed to something very implausible, namely, something like there being objective requirements, demands without a demander. How can there be such things?
Yeah. So on that, okay. So Eric, I take to be making that kind of second version, the one that's like it's about as obvious to me that it's wrong to torture people for fun as it is that 2 + 2 = 4. Really,
right, and it doesn't have much to do with what other people say. Though that helps. I mean, if everybody sort of disagreed with me, that would be bad news. But for the most part, it's not defeated by the consensus against it. It's quite the opposite. There's like consensus in favor of the view that you shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. It also seems really true to me that you shouldn't be doing that kind of thing. And so, yeah, that was supposed to be the sort of justification. And then the thought is, well, when I consider, so this is what I think the Moorean arguments are distinctive about them. They're comparing the premises in various arguments. So I have an argument that that there are moral truths. It's wrong to torture people for fun. If it's wrong to torture people for fun, then there are moral truths. Therefore, there are moral truths. That's an argument. It has premises. Then there are arguments against the view that there are moral truths, and they involve claims about metaphysical queerness, or the supervenience, or disagreement, or the source of normative practical reasons. There are all these sorts of things. And then I just say, well, look, let's look at your premises. Let's look at mine. Mine involve these really uncontroversial, really intuitively clear premises leading to just by one premise that's highly intuitively plausible and agreed upon with a trivial entailment to the conclusion that there are moral truths. And then all these other ones are highly controversial, not intuitively plausible, many steps. And then I just say, look, let's look at the plausibility of all these, lay them all out before us. And it looks like the Moorean argument is going to come on top in terms of plausibility of the conclusion. And that's supposed to be how it works. I take it that you mostly got that. So yeah, that's roughly how the argument works. And it's actually nice to hear Jonas say that the evolutionary debunking argument isn't supposed to engage the intuitive plausibility sort of form of the argument, in which case I'd be like, great, then there's no defeaters, or at least no clear defeaters for the other than, okay, but I take it Jonas's thought is, no, it's the metaphysical queerness of the thing that you're committed to, which is this irreducible normativity or something like that. And that's when I would want to appeal to just the weirdness of philosophy in general. When you get to the foundations of anything, it's weird across the board. Here's yet another place where it's weird. They're all weird in their own distinct way. And Jonas earlier mentioned, they all have different, like maybe there's some disanalogies between all these cases. They all have their, distinct weirdness. I think morality has its own distinct weirdness, but every domain has its own distinct weirdness.
Let me ask one quick clarification. I hope this doesn't throw anybody off. Jonas, I want to hear your response to what Eric just said, but at several points in the conversation, you've both used this term irreducibly normative. If I'm understanding that correctly, that just means that is that the idea of stance independent? Like there's not some like infinite chain of we do this thing's valuable because like we ought to do this thing because X, and then we ought to do X because of Y, and we ought to do Y because of Z, or something like that. Eventually it ends, the chain ends, and that you have a norm. There's nothing that it can be reduced to further. It's not going to be reduced to something non-normative. It's just a norm at the end, and that's it.
Some of that sounded right to me, but perhaps it will be useful if I say this. I think it's useful to contrast the irreducibly normative with things like conventional requirements, rules of chess and football and so on. I'd like to call those requirements reducibly normative. Why are they reducible? Well, because they seem to me to reduce to something that is not normative. We can explain them in terms of expectations and preferences. That's how we explain conventions. So that's how I think of the contrast, and that's not possible for the irreducibly normative.
Right. Yeah, I think of irreducible normativity as just not reducible, where reducible is reducible to institutional norms. Like Jonas said, you shouldn't kick the ball back to the goalie. Why not? Well, because you're gonna lose. You're gonna risk kicking an own goal or something like that, which is bad for your team or something like that. But it just is entirely reducible to what the goal of the game is rather than anything deeper than that. Whereas irreducible normativity is not reducible to things like institutional norms.
Okay. And this is an expression that has become in vogue in recent years, but you could use other terms as well. You could talk about objective prescriptivity, as Mackey did in his book from 1977. You could talk about, stance independent requirements, as Eric did earlier. I mean, I think these are different ways of trying to verbalize this phenomenon that I find strange and credible.
So now retracing the steps a bit, Eric offers a Moorean argument. Jonas, you don't appeal, at least with respect to Eric's version of the Moorean argument, you don't appeal to the evolutionary debunking arguments. Maybe evolutionary debunking arguments work on some versions of the Moorean argument, but not Eric's. What you would appeal to, Jonas, is this kind of metaphysical queerness of what I guess the first, if I'm looking at Eric's argument, it's got two premises and a conclusion. I would take it that the second premise is just this trivial entailment of the first. So you're probably not going to reject that premise. Instead, you would reject the first premise, and you're rejecting it on the basis of, hey, that involves this thing called stance independence, and stance independence is just very weird. Am I following that the dialectic so far?
Stance independence in itself is not weird. It's the combination of stance independence and prescriptivity or normativity. It's objective prescriptivity, as Mackie said. That's strange. I mean, objectivity is not strange in itself. Prescriptivity is not strange in itself. It's the conjunction.
Okay, I see.
That makes for a strange whole.
Okay.
And if I could just add like another step in the dialectic, it would just be this, like, oh, well, if you don't like the stance independent version, what you could do is just interpret the claim that it's wrong to torture people for fun, just as sort of not taking a stand on whether it's stance independently true that you shouldn't torture people for fun. It's just claiming it's true that you shouldn't torture people for fun. Who knows what the right interpretation of that? Maybe it's a constructivist interpretation. Maybe it's an expressivist one. Maybe it's a realist one. In any case, it's just so then you get an argument against the error theory specifically, but not for realism. The idea isn't like I'm trying to get all the way to realism. It's just I'm trying to get to not error theory. And so in order for that first premise to be true, it doesn't have to be that realism is true. It could be realism or expressivism or constructivism. And then it looks more plausible because it doesn't make as strong a commitment to irreducible normativity or stance independence or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, like I said before, I mean, I think that's a kind of a strange approach. It's like saying when we, like I said about free will, it's like presupposing that that we have free will or that people are responsible, or think about take thought and discourse about God again. If you have as one of your criterion of adequacy that there is a God, then I mean, before you have started investigating what we are committed to in our thought and discourse about God, I think that's a bit it's a kind of it's an odd approach. I think you should keep all possibilities open at the beginning of inquiry.
Well, the idea is it's up for revision. So it's a premise and it's up for revision. But the point, so it's not as though like this has to be true under any conditions or something like that. It's just, okay, so under some interpretation, it's true that you shouldn't burn people alive or whatever. Who knows what the correct interpretation is? I'm not taking a stand on it in that sense. I'm sort of open to it. But the idea is that's the premise that strikes me as very, very intuitively plausible. Mm-hmm. And so maybe if other air theoretic arguments are so strong that it sort of undermines the idea that it's wrong to burn people alive on any interpretation, then okay, I've got to give up that claim. It's not as though like, I'm never giving it up though the heavens may fall. No, if like the arguments for air theory were so awesome that they outweighed the plausibility of that premise, then it would go. But the idea is that's the arguments against or for air theory aren't that strong. That is, they don't undermine that claim on any interpretation. It may undermine it on one. I actually don't think it does, even the realist interpretation, but it definitely doesn't undermine it on all interpretations.
May I ask on this particular point? So it seems I am genuinely trying very hard to understand. So I hope I'm not misrepresenting you all. It seems like Eric's point in reply to but this conjunction of objectivity and prescriptivity is just very weird. Eric kind of has two responses to that. He only mentioned one just now, which is I'm taking him to be saying, hey, the error theory has several commitments, and you could give up. You can pick which one you want to give up based on which ones are more obvious than others. You want to keep the more obvious ones and give up the less obvious ones. And it sounds like, at least for Eric, he's thinking, hey, I'm more confident about the parts that still commit me to, like, I guess, stance independence over like things like cognitivism is true. Or am I following that part? Because Eric, you think it's more obvious to be like an expressivist than it is to be an error theorist.
That's right. Yeah. What I'm saying is I'm more confident that it's wrong to do certain things than I am that expressivism is false or constructivism is false. In other words, I'm willing to give up like the stance independent thing if it preserves the claim that it's wrong to do these things. And why is that? Is it just because like I have to have this under any circumstance? No, because when I consider like, oh, should I burn this person alive for the reading light it provides? It seems as obvious as anything. As 2 + 2 is 4, as, it's possible that I wore a red shirt. It seems equally plausible that, yeah, I definitely shouldn't do that. Now it seems clear to me that it's stance independent, but I'm willing to give that up because it's less clear to me that it's stance independent than that I just shouldn't do it under some interpretation of that claim. So the idea isn't like I have to keep the wrongness no matter what. It's like the wrongness is the thing that strikes me as really, really plausible, less plausible than stance independence or cognitivism. So that's why I'm willing to retreat to other views before I give up the claim that it's wrong. It's not like I have to have it under any circumstance. That's the clear thing. That's the sort of obvious thing to me.
But if wrongness could be so different, I mean, it could be stance independent, it could be stance dependent. What is it that you find so? Obvious?
Yeah, it's that if I were given the prospect, like, hey, Eric, you need to read a book tonight. The only source we have is the burning this person. Is it a good idea? Is it justifiable? Is it the right way to proceed to burn this person in order to get the light? What I find plausible is no, don't do that. You should. It's not a good idea. It's not justified. It's a bad idea. It's not the thing to do. That's the sort of thing that I find super plausible.
Well, I think something that lies close to hand here as well is something that we touched upon before, namely the connection between emotions, cognitive attitudes, and moral judgments. I mean, what seems very plausible is that this scenario of burning a person in order to use him as a candlelight, that strikes horror, right? It's prompts all kinds of negative reactions. Yeah. And I'm certainly not going to do that. Never in my life. I mean, there are all these kinds of attitudes, and I think they are easily mixed up with the confidence that it's wrong.
Yeah.
And also there is the emotional, shall we say, resistance that we feel about saying that it isn't wrong, because this can be, I think, can be sensibly taken as an indication that it doesn't strike horror in you to burn people alive. But I can assure you that it does strike horror in me.
Right. Yeah. This is why I, in some ways, hate using these. The point of these isn't to like condemn people who embrace the error theory and say, how dare you not, share my judgment. Of course, I know that you do. It's just, these are supposed to be the clearest cases. And unfortunately, we're talking about the foundations of morality. So it has to be a very clear moral case. And in those, what are the really clear moral cases? It's like the really horrifying ones. So that's why I use the horrifying, not to say like, shame on you for not agreeing with me. Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say like, yeah, that is a particularly like emotionally, engaged sort of example. But, you could use lots of different ones. Like you kill somebody like, 10 billion light years away. Would it be permissible for you to snap your finger to kill someone 10 million light years away that you've never met and you don't even know what they're like, just because, it's sort of fun. You just hear the snap. The answer is no, you shouldn't do that. And it's not like I'm especially emotionally engaged in that person. I don't even know who the person is. I don't know what their circumstances are. And still, it seems like, no, the benefit of a little snap isn't worth killing somebody, even 10 billion light years away, even though I don't know them or care about them. And, I guess I think it's not clear to me that like the emotion is part of it. It was a contingent feature of the example that I gave. But I mean, even when I just reflect on, would it be okay to snap my fingers to kill somebody I've never met 10 billion light years away? Even not even a human, just like some creature I've never seen. No. But so yeah, I don't think the emotion is a crucial part of it, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So here's another thing: is like, as you've seen, like there's a bit of a stalemate here, and that's I guess how philosophy goes. Yeah. What I was going to suggest is, a lot of these premises that, there's a stalemate not only about like the premises in the Moorean argument, but there's stalemate about all the premises in the error theoretic arguments, about like queerness and the conceptual entailments of our moral discourse. And I guess I think, like, given all that controversy and all that uncertainty, I guess it's hard for me to see that, like, the best thing, all things considered, philosophically, is to give up on these sorts of claims that, strike me as intuitively obvious as any claims in philosophy. That is, the claim that it's wrong to do whatever bad action we want to describe. As clear as, that, there is motion, that there is time, that this event is happening after World War II, and so on. I guess I think, given all the stalemate about these arguments, it seems like don't give up the thing that seems clearly true to you. But again, I'm sure, I know you have your responses too. So more stalemate.
Well, I think I guess I would like to again repeat what I said before about explanation. I mean, moral truths don't explain anything outside morality, but I think truths about motion do, right?
Does the error theory explain anything? Like, what does the error theory explain? It doesn't look like it doesn't any explaining either, but you wouldn't want to give up on that just because it doesn't do the relevant explaining.
No,
it explains like why there's no normative truth or something like that. But of course, I would say, well, realism explains why there are more.
No, I don't mean to. Appeal to this as a general philosophical principle. I'm just trying to explain why I, like I said before, why I'm not convinced about the why I'm not convinced by the Moorean propositions in the moral case, whereas I do find them more forceful in other areas, like in with respect to motion and consciousness, like we said before. And,
I'm writing down. I'm trying to map out the dialectic here.
I mean, we actually
for Eric,
agree about a lot. We actually agree about a lot. So maybe we agree about a lot. So maybe that's why the dialectic is a bit difficult to.
It does. This stood out to me so far. It actually does seem like you all agree on at least one point in the methodology, and that is like sticking with what seems most obvious. It sounded like, or it might have been 30 minutes ago at this point, but I seem to recall, Jonas, you saying, yeah, I think that's we don't want to go in with like we're free no matter what. There things are right or wrong in this stance independent way, no matter what. It's all up for revision, but you, as a point of general methodology, you want to try and stick with what seems really obvious. And if you have to give up something, if you've got things seem obvious, but some of those are in tension, you want to give up the less obvious ones.
Right. Yeah. You revise the obvious only if there's even more obvious that comes to overthrow it. That's it. Which I think we do agree on, I think.
Yeah. So we're going to wrap up really soon. Let me just run what I've got by you so far. This will be the hour and 15-minute conversation in like 1 minute version. Eric laid out a 3-step argument that was like his Moorean argument. He said, premise 1 is it strikes many people as really obvious. It sounds like Jonas, at least initially, like prima facie on the face of it, premise 1 does seem obvious. But Jonas, your reply to that is saying, but that premise requires objectivity and prescriptivity, like this conjunction of the two. And that conjunction is very weird, very strange. Eric says kind of 2 things in response. One is, well, so is a lot of other stuff in philosophy.
Especially the foundation of philosophy. That's right.
And on that point, Jonas, it sounds like you're saying, but that other stuff in philosophy, like consciousness, motion, causation, whatever, you can actually, it's explanatory. Like you can use it to explain things. But in the case of normative truths, they don't really explain things. And Eric replied to that, but it doesn't seem like the error theory explains things. And you had to reply to that. I'm going to terminate that little chain of the discussion. That was like on Eric's second point. The other one was in response to when you said objectivity and prescriptivity, the conjunction of the two is very weird. Eric's other point was, let's see, what did I write? Oh, you could give up several points in the your error theory is made up of several commitments, and you could give up. You can choose which ones you want to give up. And Eric's saying, I'm going to stick with what's obvious, which is that it's wrong. That would you'd have to give that up for error theory. I'm going to stick with that one, and I'll prefer to give up one of the other commitments, even if that leads to something like expressivism or something like that.
Can I just comment on that last point? Or are you...
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So this is something I should have said before. Of course, you can give up on the sort of cognitivist point, for example, or the stance independence point. But then I have to say I no longer know what you're doing, because then you're no longer. I think you're failing then to accounting for our ordinary moral thought and discourse. And it seems to me that that might not even be what you're aspiring to. So I'm not sure what you're doing if you're giving up on those very plausible premises. That seems to me it's kind of a different project, different from the usual traditional meta-ethical project, which I take to be descriptive in its point and purpose.
Yeah. I think of myself as sort of ranking meta-ethical views in terms of their plausibility. And so the idea was I take, non-naturalist realism to be the most plausible, but, if that doesn't work, then the next most plausible is something like constructivism. And if that doesn't work, then like expressivism. And if that doesn't work, then maybe error theory. So what I imagine myself to be doing was to say like, these arguments that people throw at non-naturalism, if they succeed against non-naturalism, they wouldn't immediately favor error theory. They would favor some other theory, because the best, combination of views in light of the criticism of non-naturalism would be some other view, and error theory would come in last, is what I'm saying. Okay. That's not to say like I think error theory is stupid. It's just, there's lots of plausible views in metaethics, and I think.
Okay, but then you're open to the thought that we might actually, regrettably, as you would say, end up with error theory if it turns out that there are conclusive arguments against non-cognitivism and conclusive arguments against constructivism and other naturalist positions. Then we might have to settle for error theory in the end.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, if there are like overwhelmingly plausible criticisms of constructivism, so plausible that they outweigh the plausibility of the criticisms of error theory, then I guess we'll have to be error theorists.
Okay, yeah, that sounds fair. I mean, what I reacted to was this idea that we should, if it turns out that non-naturalism is indefensible, then we should opt for example, non-cognitivism in order to save the conclusion that torture is wrong or whatever, torturing innocents is wrong or whatever. But that seems to me strange. Then I don't know what the point of such a project would be. It doesn't seem to be the traditional descriptive project that I think we're engaged in when we do meta-ethics.
All right. We've got about 12 minutes left, and I had two questions, one for each of you that haven't really, maybe one came up a little bit. So let me start with you, Jonas. At no point in the conversation did I hear an argument from disagreement come up. So what do you think about the relevance of an argument from disagreement for the error theory, and I guess for Moorean arguments?
I don't think we can go from disagreement to any sort of well, at least we can't go from premises about disagreement to any sort of metaphysical conclusion, that's for sure. We might go from premises about disagreement to some kinds of epistemic conclusions, of course, but that's an extremely risky business, as I'm sure Eric can tell you as well, because it threatens to be self-undermining, of course. I mean, there's disagreement everywhere in philosophy. So if disagreement suffices for skepticism or what have you, then then we are in trouble. We're all in trouble, even the skeptics.
Okay. And Eric, let me ask you this. So the Euthyphro dilemma came up once, but it was only touched on briefly. What kind of moral realist are you? Are you a moral realist that grounds morality, not just moral knowledge? I can understand how we come to know the moral truths. I can understand the appeal there to theism and say, well, God factors into that explanation of how we come to know the moral truths. But in terms of the moral truths themselves, does God factor into your explanation of morality? And if so, how do you avoid the Euthyphro dilemma?
So I'm certainly open to the suggestion that God in some way grounds the moral truths. Maybe like if he like is identical to the good or identical to truth and beauty and wisdom and all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's right. But right now I sort of like lightly hold the view that there are moral truths independent of God, and that God is the kind of person who matches up or who gets his conduct in order with the moral truths. So he looks to them and then commands on that basis and acts on that basis rather than sort of being the source himself. Though, I mean, these are like super deep theological issues that I don't have worked out at all. So if it turns out that like actually what you thought of as the moral, truths are actually fundamentally grounded in some really like, hard to grasp level in God's nature or something like that, fair enough. That's fine with me. But I just know that the normative is very vast. So, there's facts about what you ought to feel, what you ought to believe, about political truths, about what reactions are justified to certain behavior, and of course, what you ought to do in terms of morality. And it's not clear to me how like facts about God's nature or his commands are going to ground all those normative truths. So that's why, I sort of tentatively hold the view that the normative truths are independent of God's commands or nature or anything like that. But, I hold that view pretty lightly.
Okay. I've got one final question, and it's for each of you. You can each comment on this one. So something I've been thinking about lately is the why be moral question. And it strikes me that it's almost like it's that question is doing the same sort of work that the Euthyphro dilemma is doing in a way. It's you take God out of the picture, but now we're just talking about their moral truths. And it's asking, well, why obey those, like why act in accordance with those moral truths? Just like why would I act in accordance with what God commands? So yeah, what do you all think about the why be moral question?
Do you want to start, Jonas?
I've always found it deeply puzzling. I mean, what's the is the question somehow about why is it in my interest to be moral? Whether it is in my interest to be, whether it is in my self-interest to be moral, or is it about whether I ought to be moral? Well, then of course there's the question: well, what is this ought here? So I've always been puzzled by the question, not sure what it's really about. I guess historically it's been a lot of times it's been understood as a question of, is it in your self-interest to be moral? And some historical figures like Aristotle and David Hume and John Stuart Mill, they have responded that yes, it is in your self-interest to be moral, because well, roughly speaking, you'll lead a better life if you don't only care about your self-interest, but also care about others and also care about their well-being. So the answer is yes. You ought to be moral partly for reasons of self-interest. But again, it's also a puzzling question. It's not clear what it's really about.
Yeah, I think Jonas is basically right. There are many ways to hear the question. One is, what incentive do I have? Like, what goodies am I going to get if I act morally? And the answer to that is, well, I don't know. And in some cases, you'll get goodies if you act morally. In some cases, you won't. So in some cases, there's no incentive to act morally. But if the question is asking, what reason do I have? That is, what considerations would justify me in acting morally? The answer is always going to appeal to whatever moral interests are at stake in the relevant question. So why should I save this person from drowning? Why be moral in that sense? Well, because it's of little cost to yourself, and it would be a great benefit to this person. That's the reason. So the question, why be moral? Why? Ask for a reason. So I supply the reason. You say, why should I save this person? Answer, because it would cost you little and it would be a great benefit to them. That's why. And so for any sort of particular question of why be moral in this case, you're always just going to appeal to the first order moral considerations. That is the interests that are at stake. And that's going to answer your question, why be moral? That's going to supply the reason. But of course, we should always be open to the suggestion that, there may not be any interest of yours that is furthered by acting morally. Maybe it's the case that Plato is correct that, every time you act moral or immorally, you destroy your own soul or something like that. But maybe not. So, yeah.
All right. I think now is a good time to wrap up. So let me just say, I really appreciate both of you coming on. I need to clear my throat. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate both of you coming on. Thank you so much for doing it. Did you all want to leave us, the audience, with any particular thought about the conversation? If all you can say is I enjoyed it too, that's good.
I mean, I certainly had a good time. There was one thing that I just wanted to mention. It's not a concern that Jonas brought up, but it's often sort of out there. I think part of the methodology that I use is sort of appealing to what strikes me as clearly true or something like that. And a lot of people object to that because they think, oh, well, intuition, that's junk. You shouldn't do that. I just want to suggest that, basically everybody who does philosophy has to appeal to intuition at some point. Everybody has premises, foundational premises of their argument in virtue of it that don't enjoy any more further support than their intuitive plausibility. So I think we're just like, yes, it's true. I appeal to intuition here. I think everybody who does philosophy has to do that. Anytime you're evaluating the strength or weakness of an argument, you're reflecting on the intuitive strength or plausibility of those premises. Anytime you're thinking about the best explanation for this or that, you're relying on your intuition about what strikes you as more plausible. Anytime you think of the theoretical virtues and how important they are relative to one another, simplicity and explanatory power and all that stuff, you're appealing to intuition. So it's true. I unapologetically appeal to intuition. I think everybody has to do that. So I just wanted to, I know there's a lot of people out there sympathetic to error theory who think like, you can't appeal to intuition. That's junk. And I just want to say, we all have to do it. That's philosophy. Get used to it.
I agree with that. And it's good to be reminded once in a while.
All right. Well, I'll speak very quickly to the audience. If you all enjoyed this video, please give it a like, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you value the content that I'm making here, please consider becoming a patron. You'll be able to get early access to videos. You'll also get to be a part of the private Facebook group and the book club. So the link to become a patron is in the description. I'll also put a link to Eric's paper on Moorean arguments in the description, and I'll put a link to Jonas's book on error theory in the description as well, so people can check those out for more. All right, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Great.